some interesting topics focusing on risk management models, and we're going to take a look at a practical view of governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC. I'm sure many of you know what GRC is all about, but we're going to take a different viewpoint of what GRC means to you. 10 tips for developing risk-based internal controls. We're going to take a look at developing standards of internal controls and what operational standards, financial standards, and compliance standards mean, and a different view of the risk assessment process. And actually, I'll provide you with an interesting roadmap for the risk management process. And just a little bit more about my background. I've actually worked with about 30 Fortune 100 teams to help with some fraud prevention and some actually risk management process. And that's where I got some of these ideas that we'll talk about today. So we'll look at starting with some risk management models. So risk management means different things to different people. And it actually becomes increasingly important because more and more stakeholders within our businesses are becoming concerned about risk. And sometimes they become concerned about risk if there's a problem, if there's a fraud, if there's a natural disaster, if there's not a contingency plan in place, if something happens and there's a great deal of running around wondering, well, why didn't we have that on our radar screen? And risk may also be a driver of a strategic decision. And what sometimes happens is your CFO or your CEO or your controller or maybe even your CIO may be being kept awake at night wondering if they've addressed a certain aspect properly. And sometimes risk management really needs to be embedded in the activities of the organization. And these are some of the things that we'll actually talk about today. How do you actually embed some of these concepts of risk management and compliance management right within your organization and some of the day-to-day activities through some of the controls and some of the management concepts? So what are some risk management models that need to be considered? So a well-defined risk management model will actually allow your organization to focus and actually achieve some of the key objectives. And we'll talk about what some of the models actually help us do. And can actually take a look at cutting across the organization to actually oversee the entire risk management process. Ensure that risks are managed proactively, being proactive. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? And specific areas and activities. And gain assurance about the effectiveness of how well you're actually managing risk. And successfully respond to a risk event and a change event within a timely fashion. As Ramesh mentioned, I spent some time at MCI. Well, as many of you know, MCI was formerly WorldCom, and I was brought in to help WorldCom recover from a major fraud, one of the biggest frauds in history. And I was working with one of the risk management executives, and he had a great big spreadsheet. And I said, well, do you have a risk management process? He said, oh, sure, I've got this spreadsheet, and I have everything documented. And I said, well, you've got, a good tracking mechanism to define all the potential risks that could possibly happen, whether it's compliance, which, we'll get into certainly as we go through the slides. You've got all sorts of financial risk. You've got all the different types of risk identified, but who's going to respond? What are your plans? Whose responsibility is it? He says, oh, good point. So he was so busy tracking, everything that could happen, but didn't really have a plan in place, didn't have anything prioritized. So I was actually taking a look at how well the roadmap was documented, and I actually helped him put some priorities in place and develop a roadmap and some ownership around how well MCI should proceed, particularly as a kind of a get well plan to address some of the risk And again, you can't possibly address all the risk factors at the same time as you're developing your risk management approach. So one of the models that's very well known is called the Enterprise Risk Management Model. And this was developed by the the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, or COSO. And COSO is another way of looking at internal controls. And it's an approach to risk management that, as we mentioned earlier on a previous slide, it enables an organization to consider the potential impact of all the types of risks on processes, activities, stakeholders, products, and services. So it allows you to focus on, what does this risk mean to my business, and is it going to get in the way of my business actually meeting its objectives? So what you really want to do is how is this risk going to impact my company, and is it going to impact my ability to meet my objectives, either as a total entity or as a business unit? So you can see it takes a look at objectives, components, and entity units. And the components here are in the internal environment, objective setting, the event verification, the risk assessment, the risk outcome, the control activities, information and communication and monitoring. So it's very similar to the